Well, welcome everybody, and I'm so glad everyone is here today. We have a really fantastic discussion coming up just ahead. My name is Laurel Ackerman. I head up marketing at Elastio. I will be moderating this webinar, and I'm just going to run through a couple of short housekeeping notes before we dive into the main event. We will make sure that we have time for Q&A at the end of this webinar, so please use the Q&A feature in Zoom at the bottom of your screen to submit questions. We'll compile all of them and get to them at the end. And then second, everyone who registered will receive the recording. So after this broadcast is over, keep an eye on your inbox in the next day or so, and you will be receiving the recording for yourself, and you can also share it with your team. So with that, now we can jump right in to the main event today. Our webinar today, it's incredibly pertinent. It's super important in today's environment, and I'm really excited that we're able to talk about it. We're going to be discussing why XDR is not enough to stop ransomware attacks, and also providing some information on what you can do about it, given that. So with that, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce our speakers. We have Dr. Srinidhi Varadarajan, our chief scientist at Elastio. He started his malware career over 20 years ago with Dark Avenger, more than 25 years of experience architecting and building virtualization platforms, advanced networks, high-performance computing environments, scalable file systems, and storage subsystems. He's done a ton. And prior to Elastio, he was the founder and CTO of 5 prior successful companies, including Cloudistics and Aperture, which was acquired by Dell. So we're super lucky to have him on the team as well as the webinar. And then joining him is Allan Liska, also known as the ransomware sommelier. He's a senior security architect and ransomware expert at Recorded Future. Allan has over 20 years of experience in ransomware and information security, and he specializes in improving organization security posture using more effective intelligence. Allan sits on numerous national ransomware task forces, speaks at global conferences, and has authored numerous books as well. So welcome, Allan.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks to both of you so much for being here today. We have a ton to cover, so I am just gonna dig in, hand this over, and I'll start with the first question. Allan, I'm gonna start with you first. Could you talk a little bit about how you would describe today's ransomware threat landscape?
Bad. You probably want me to elaborate on that, but yeah, just bad in general is what we're talking about here. And just think about the last couple of months, right? Just not even the last couple of months, the last month, we've had Caesars and MGM, which in an ordinary year would be months of coverage, but then right after that you had the ICBC, the International Commerce Bank of China, and then right after that, that would be months of coverage, but then right after that you had 30 emergency rooms go down when Ardent Health was hit by a ransomware attack and patients were being turned away. And then right after that, you had 3 water utilities being hit by ransomware in the same week. So it's just been swivel, one story after another, and one group after another. So we had so much coverage of Clop and what they did with Move It, and then when they came out with the SysAid vulnerability that they started attacking, and we went from them to Scattered Spider and everything that Scattered Spider is doing with social engineering and new ways of initial access, and then we switched over to LockBit and what they've been doing with Citrix Bleed and going after and attacking Citrix Bleed. So it's like bam, 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 bam. You can't get a break. Just in healthcare. Healthcare is an area that I'm particularly concerned about, because I think attacking hospitals is just about the worst thing you can do, except for attacking schools, which is the other thing that ransomware actors really do. And we've had 320, through the end of November, we had 320 plus ransomware attacks against healthcare providers around the world. And those are just the ones we know about. The real number is probably a lot higher than that. That means that we've gone from one healthcare ransomware attack a month to one a week to almost one a day that we're dealing with, and that's just one sector. You multiply that across all of the sectors. Manufacturing's been hit really hard. The legal sector's been hit really hard. Retail's been hit really hard, and their attack season hasn't even started yet, because ransomware actors love to go after retail in December because they know if they can disrupt retail operations, they are more likely to get paid, because you can't afford to be down if you're a retail operation this time of year.
Yep.
So you have a confluence of events where the ransomware marketplace is bigger than ever before, not just with the ransomware actors, but with all the support groups that are behind it, the initial access brokers, the developers, negotiators, the money launderers, all of this sort of support infrastructure for all of these ransomware groups. So you have more people carrying out ransomware than ever, but then you also have more people helping them. And because of that, there's so much money in ransomware right now, it just keeps getting reinvested to make better and worse ransomware. And we're seeing this reflected just in the stories that, nobody can keep up with it. I'm sure there are people that are listening that they're like, oh yeah, I forgot about MGM and Caesars, or I didn't hear about Ardent Health, because there's so much to keep track of. So I know that's a lot to start with, but to your point, it's been really bad, and you're just basically, your head's on a swivel as you're trying to keep up with everything that's going on.
Yeah, no, that's a lot. That's a really great description, and I think pretty accurate in terms of how people are looking at it. Srinidhi, do you have anything to add to that before we start talking?
Allan's comment was actually pretty apt. The number of attacks is literally being measured in multiple per day when you're looking across various sectors. And when we say multiple per day, these are not even like small script kiddie hits that we are not even really tracking. These are the ones that are, larger, more sophisticated operators that went after a major operation and managed to bring the whole thing down, a hospital down, a school down, or in the case of MGM, an entire casino down. This took considerable skill to do, considerable skill to get through all the defenses that are typically set up there. But this is the level of skill of threat actors today in the landscape.
A lot to consider there. Following on that, Srinidhi, I wanted to see if you could walk through how, given the fact that there's all of these EDR and XDR solutions out there in place, companies are spending millions of dollars on their security solutions, but these threat actors are managing to get through. Can you walk through a little bit about how they're doing that?
Absolutely. So the first thing to realize in there is the whole point of this exercise is not to say that EDR or XDR is bad. Any good security posture should have perimeter defenses, including EDR and XDR. The point is they're not enough. There is a series of techniques EDR and XDR solutions use. And over the years, malware actors have learned to bypass them in various very clever ways. So before I describe some of the techniques that they use over there, I'm going to start with just laying out the landscape of how does a malware attack actually progress? What are the stages? What does it attempt to do? So there is an initial entry vector. This is what Allan was referring to earlier when he said initial access brokers. There are teams that specialize in getting initial entry in, whether it is through social engineering, whether it is through mail phishing, even spear phishing within emails. You need some mechanism to drop your initial start of this chain of the attack in. What does a chain look like? Once you have come into the very first step, which is you've managed to deploy something that is executable onto a user system, and the user clicked on it to begin the execution process, then the attack sequence starts unfolding. The very first thing that starts off is something called a loader. And the purpose of the loader is simply to bring in the other stages of the attack, and the subsequent stages of the attack are not fixed. They vary. The same loader can be used to bring in a variety of different malware. So one should not think of malware as this end-to-end thing. The malware is composed of various components. There are entire teams that specialize in each of those components. So the first job of the loader is to, as subtly as possible, be able to bring the second stage down by talking to an external command and control servers. There are other loaders, for example, that don't even in that first stage talk to a command and control server. They bring in enough infrastructure with them to start themselves up. But in either case, once they have managed to start themselves up, there are a few things they need to be able to do, which is the second stage of the operation. One of which is discover what is running inside the system, be able to laterally spread, provide some mechanism for remote access into the system and persistence, which is ensuring that if you rebooted the machine, the bad guys can still get back in. Once you've gotten these 3-4 stages, the next step after that is figuring out authentication, identity, and access management roles, trying to figure out how can you go laterally from that machine. And every lateral system that you're going into, you're either leaving behind a remote access Trojan or you deploy an entire command and control infrastructure. And there are entire teams that are responsible for building command and control infrastructures, Cobalt Strike probably being the most famous of them. It's actually a security tool used by penetration testers, typically red teams within companies to test their own security. And that same tool is actually misappropriated by malware guys to be able to provide beacons for their own malware running inside the infrastructure. So this is sort of the anatomy. Once the command and control infrastructure is in there, there is a good portion of your infrastructure that is now infected. The next thing that ends up happening after that is data exfiltration. And data exfiltration might happen at any stage in between, at any new machine that the malware discovers, get data out. The final stage in there is, after they've exfiltrated a bit of data, is potentially go ransom the data on top of it. That's why it's called a double attack. You pay once for getting the data they took away from your machines back, and you pay again for getting your data decrypted on the other side. And if the threat actor is not quote unquote honorable, and sometimes there is honor among thieves and sometimes there is not. If they're not honorable, then you will get the third form of attack, which is even after you have paid them for not releasing your data, they'll threaten you again with the release of data. So this is typically your end-to-end sequence. So one of the things then to watch out for is look at the major gangs. Take LockBit or any of REvil or Black Cat or any other gangs. Interesting thing to note, and how they bypass EDR, that magic generally happens in that loader stage, the very first thing that came in. So I'm going to use 2 examples to describe the sophistication of actual loaders that are out there. So the first loader I will look at is something called Iced ID. Iced ID is the loader that's used by multiple malware families, including REvil, Quantum. It originally came from Immortnet, and Iced ID continues to be developed. As of even this year, there are new variants coming out of Iced ID. The old family is what used to be known as the standard Iced ID, but this is the first loader stage. So watch what it does. You get an email, one of the most common attack forms that it uses. You get an email. The email says, hey, here is a corporate document. And typically it has a name like strategy or office, and it has a date stamp, which is how typically we even version our documents. And this looks like a Word document that was shipped to you. And it is password protected. They say corporate security says it has to be password protected. Here is the password for it. Okay. Now, what did they end up doing in that process? They hid the malware inside a password protected doc file. And since the password is different for every mail they send out, the contents of the encrypted file always look different. So you cannot signature scan this or look at an AV scanner and find it. It will be unique every single time. Now, the second step of their attack is you open this doc file, it asks you for the password is in the mail, type the password in, document opens. Only problem is the document says, I'm from an old version of Word. You need to click enable editing to get to see the rest of the document. The moment you hit that enable editing mode, macros are open. And it uses a macro to download the second stage. Now, the second stage, it downloads one of several different file types. So I will take one of the most common ones it uses, a PNG file. This is an image. So what it appears to do is download an image onto a directory in there. You open the image, it's completely transparent. It's just a transparent background. Yet inside that image is a DLL. And what this loader does, a DLL is a library, a typical Windows library that any of your dynamically linked applications use. So it goes into the PNG file. This little loader code extracts out what it has hidden inside the PNG. It's called steganography. Then it starts a standard Windows process called run DLL32, loads its DLL up into memory. That DLL then talks to the command and control server, downloads the actual malware executable as the next stage of it. So it's a 3-stage attack sequence that has largely bypassed all of the basic defenses that you can generally put in place. Now, this was a few years ago. ICE-ID has been around for some time. And it represents a different era, because the subsequent stages after ICE-ID loader comes in that era were typically manually done by humans. So when they got entry into a machine, they would start poking around the machine to try to figure out what else does it have access to. Can I go dump the credentials from a standard Windows process like LSAS and be able to get into some other machine? But this was a manual operation. Well, as money improved, we now have ransomware as a service. So the next example I take would be from LockBit, which is a gang that literally sells you an entire toolchain framework for building your own specialized malware. And LockBit uses its own loader called Blister. And LockBit's specialty is it removed the manual components in there, which is once the loader comes in, it is capable of, after the second and third stages have been deployed, laterally spreading by itself. So it removes the human element into it. And typically the numbers I've been hearing from them are order of about 79 minutes after the first machine is hit, they've got the second one. Usually the first machine they hit is not likely the one that contains any useful data to them. But from there, they start a whole trail of running through your infrastructure till they hit something where it's actually useful. Now, the loader module that sits inside LockBit is genuinely a piece of work. It is incredibly impressive in the number of different techniques it uses to bypass both EDR systems, as well as stop even human analysts from looking through it or running it. They do not want to operate inside a sandbox. They do not want to operate under a debugger. They will cut it out from around them. So how do they accomplish this? So in the case of the Blister loader, it usually shows up as a binary along with its own DLL. So one classic example it uses is, there's a little video player called VLC. It's very popular. And so it distributes VLC along with a color UI DLL. And it's not just one DLL. There's about 20 or 30 legitimate looking Microsoft dynamically linked libraries. They contain Microsoft code inside it, except they've been modified to call their malware first. So, and there's a pile of junk code inside it to obfuscate the fact that this is happening. There's about 20, 30 different DLLs that it uses in there. This is where it actually gets really good at it. Some of these DLLs are even signed. So if you check if it's got a valid code signing certificate on it, it has a valid code signing certificate on it. Some of those certificates have been revoked, but fake companies register and get the certificate and then pass it over to the malware operators. So code signing alone is not sufficient to figure this out. The part that is interesting is when they're sitting inside what looks like a standard Microsoft DLL, they're heavily encrypted. They use their own loaders in there to bring this DLL into memory. So they use no standard system-based techniques. Now, another thing that is typically used by EDR, XDR systems is what kind of Windows system calls are you using? So if you call a Windows system call, the EDR, XDR systems track what those system calls are. And then they even have machine learning to figure out, hey, is this combination of system calls potentially malicious? They make no system calls. What they do instead of making system calls is they load the underneath library, NTDLL, which typically is one of the main ones that goes to the underneath Windows system call interfaces. Instead of looking for functions within NTDLL, they hash the name of the function and then search by hash. So you will not find a single string in there that says, look for this particular function. And so that bypasses any detection of which functions were being called. They also have a nice little sleep timer. When they start up, they'll wait for 10 minutes. Why? Because their assumption is when they started up, some EDR is looking through their memory to see if it is malicious or not. It is not at that point. It will be malicious 10 minutes later, but it is not at the point at which you're looking at it. So there's several sets of bypass techniques that these guys fundamentally use in there. The last thing that they do, which they're quite good at, is they unhook everybody. It does, and they're largely egalitarian in that approach. They don't care if any other malware is on the machine or if an EDR is on the machine. They will unhook both of them. And so how does that happen? Typically, if your binary is running, it depends upon external libraries. Those libraries get loaded. One of the core libraries, as I mentioned earlier, is NTDLL, which is the Windows system call interface itself that gets loaded. EDR solutions and many other security products hook onto NTDLL. So what this piece of magic does inside IcedID's loader blister is it looks at the NTDLL that is actually loaded into memory with the malware itself. Then it uses the full path of the actual location of the Microsoft NTDLL and loads that into another region in memory and starts comparing executable sections. So if it finds that what was loaded with it is executing a piece of code that looks different from what the Microsoft DLL is supposed to be doing, it simply calls for Microsoft one and avoids the hooked DLLs running with it. So you cannot see it in process. It also removes all process breakpoints. So if you try to run it under a debugger, it will quietly exit itself and you don't see any malware in there. This is the degree of sophistication, and this is an a la carte menu. You as a malware actor can take a LockBit framework and build your own customized malware using any of the steps that you wish in here. This is the state of the art. Holding current perimeter defenses against systems that are evolving this fast is quite hard, and that's how they get through.
Yeah, it really sounds like it's a constant battle of trying to stay steps ahead, like trying to even stay even, let alone stay steps ahead for organizations. And how can you do that when you have such motivated groups? Which leads me to the next. It's fascinating. But that leads me to my next question for both of you, actually. Going to the motivation of the groups, my understanding is there are differences in motivation between various ransomware as a service actors and operators. And I'd love to cover a little bit of that because I think it's useful for organizations to understand what these motivations are in order to prepare. Allan, do you want to start on this one and then?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately the motivation is money, but there are some outliers. So for example, we see some nation states deploying ransomware. So Iran, for example, famously deploys ransomware, and while they may ask for a ransom, that's not their primary motivation. North Korea deploys ransomware as well, but they want money. North Korea is basically just a cyber criminal organization designed, pretending to be a nation state at this point. But there are some of the newer groups, and Scattered Spider is a great example of this, and before them Lapsus, that seem to be more chaos agents than motivated by money. We saw this, for example, in the ransomware attack against Caesars. They deployed ransomware. They deployed the Alpha ransomware, but they didn't deploy it systematically in a way that would cause that would cause system disruption. Minor, but nothing too big. They primarily were relying on the data extortion, but they really don't seem to be motivated by money as much as being able to disrupt these large organizations, like doing it just for the sake of doing it. Now, because we think Scattered Spider are Western based, I know some people have said specifically New York and London. I don't know that we have intelligence that actually verifies that, but they're clearly they're native or near native English speakers, so they are probably located somewhere in the West. They probably should be collecting more money because their legal defense fund is going to be super expensive when law catches up to them, and it will catch up to them. Law moves slowly, unfortunately, which is part of the problem that we see. We've seen a lot of arrests this year, which is great for these ransomware actors, but these are cases that started a year ago. It just takes a long time to build up law enforcement. I think we've all been lulled into a false sense of how efficient law enforcement is by shows like Law and Order, where in 30 minutes the guy's arrested, and then in another 30 minutes they're going to trial and sentenced. Unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. And so law enforcement is sort of catching up to a lot of these people, but it also goes to show, we talk about ransomware as, and LockBit's a great example, as Russia-based, and a lot of the core operators are based in Russia, but because there's so much money in it, we're seeing ransomware operators spring up around the world. We're seeing pockets of it in Brazil. We're seeing pockets in Pakistan, in India. We're seeing parts of it in South Africa. We're seeing ransomware operators. They just the South Korean government just arrested some operators that were working with North Korea in Seoul. So we are seeing these ransomware operations spring up in other parts of the world, because if there's money to be made, people are going to want to do it. But broadly speaking, money is the primary motivation. I don't know what the nice way to say this is. Feel free to bleep it out. But also motivation appears to be sometimes they just want to be bastards. Like that's when we see ransomware actors going after schools. Schools don't have any money. We've seen ransomware actors that have hit food banks. Like, a food bank doesn't have any money to pay a ransom. You're just being a jackass at that point. Don't do that. Earlier this year, one of LockBit's affiliates hit the Sick Kids Hospital in Canada. It's a children's hospital for people that don't have any money, and any kid can go there and their parents have a place to stay. And LockBit got somewhat good press for the fact that he gave the key to the hospital so that they could decrypt all the files, and said, no, we don't go after children's hospitals. You went after a children's hospital. Just because you gave them the key doesn't mean they don't have months and months and hundreds of thousands of dollars of incident response bills to pay. Don't hit hospitals. I mean, don't hit anything. Go be not ransomware, but you don't get brownie points because you gave somebody the key back after you broke into their house. Like, you still get arrested.
Right.
Sorry, that was a completely different tangent.
No, it's great to get that perspective. I mean, that's it's definitely something to think about. Like, these motivations are not, they're not strictly financial, which I think is what typically, and maybe even historically, ransomware has been. It's gotten much more chaotic, to use your word, than that, which is a whole different ball of wax.
And to add to what?
Yeah, I was going to ask if you could weigh in.
So to add to what Allan was saying, this is actually very interesting. One distinction I typically make in my mind is between sort of malware and ransomware. Some malware have ransomware, and there are some malware do not have any ransomware component at all. So all ransomware is malware, but the vice versa is not true. So when that is the case, sometimes you find, as Allan pointed out, you might find nation state actors who, while they're looking for, some might be looking for money. Some other nation state actors have no interest in either no interest in the monetary component of it. They are there for industrial espionage of various forms. And that is one level of threat. And that is a much more significant level of threat, simply because it has the might of a nation state in many cases, with a lot of people potentially behind it doing this. The second set are the standard sort of malware / ransomware gangs that are purely financially incented to do their stuff. And this also classifies into various levels depending upon the sophistication of the attacker and literally the money they've got and the risk tolerance they have got inside their setup. Actors like LockBit, for example, they are most likely Russian. I mean, at least according to the intel. But the interesting thing about it is that they seem to be relatively apolitical in that, other than not hitting sites in Russia, they have actually hit sites in places that you would not normally expect them to hit. The ICBC example being one of them. The Bank of China was not generally thought of to be a valid target for what would be a Russian ransomware gang. And LockBit's general message when it goes out to the market is, hey, it's just money. They literally say that in the ransom note. We are not here to harm anybody, it's just money. Okay. And the other thing that they hold to at their end is, if you deliver the money, they'll deliver the goods at the other side. Whether it's the ransom key to be delivered, or if you're paying for the data not getting exfilled, or not disclosed after it got exfiltrated, publicly released after it got exfiltrated, they will not do that. And if you do not, they will actually release your data. They have done that part also multiple times. Whether they have any scruples or morals is on a case-by-case basis. Generally speaking, the only scruples they hold is the money in my wallet or not.
So
Well, and
interesting.
I
So
think-
they have a strict code of conduct, but with their own motivations behind it, like their own code of conduct.
Well, I think LockBit's kind of a great example of that, though, because LockBit is, I think, really the last large open ransomware as a service model. Most modern ransomware, so if you look at like Alpha/Black Hat and some of these others, they're closed ransomware as a service. So they're very restrictive about who they allow in. For LockBit, anybody who pays the 10 to 20 grand initiation fee can be an affiliate. But because of that, they are so large that they've kind of lost that control. LockBit didn't want one of their affiliates going after ICBC. I can tell you that. They don't want entanglements with China. They didn't want one of their affiliates to go after Royal Mail earlier this year, because, again, you start going after government agencies, then
they will
that's
come
when
for you.
drones come out.
Yeah.
So it is one of these things that we're seeing where they start to become victims of their own success as they've gotten too big. And we saw that with Conti, right? Conti became too big, right. And then, they made one wrong statement, and there was a, pissed off Ukrainian researcher that's like, guess what? You're done.
Here's your code.
And the same thing happened with Revol, and so as these organizations, and it is an organization, as it gets really big, they lose that level of control that we're talking about here. And they can say, yeah, we're going to kick this affiliate out. What's to stop the affiliate from if they've made a lot of money, from just creating a new email address, giving them a new $20,000 and starting back up? So so I do think that it is absolutely right that they've got their own sort of guidelines and morals, but I also think they've lost a little bit of control of the of the plot here.
We'll have to do a whole webinar just on that next time, I think.
After they're arrested, absolutely.
After they're arrested, do a post-mortem of that. I am going to move on to another question. Thank you for all of that. And this again is for both, but I wanted to cover a little bit about whether your perspective on attacker sophistication varying in different market segments. This, I think, is a topic that has come up. Srinidhi, do you want to start on this one?
Sure. So attacker sophistication and attackers' risk tolerance, we find typically are correlated. Those that are good know how good they are, and they have a significantly higher risk tolerance because they know what they can get through. And their targets are also bigger. They're elephant hunters.
Mm-hmm.
There are also mouse hunters out there, because there are a lot of mice out in the world as well. Small attacks, get paid a little bit and get out quickly. You don't have the sophistication to be able to get past many defenses. So let me walk through some examples there. So at one extreme, you've got attackers that within 30 minutes of initial entry will encrypt your machine, and charge you. They do not attempt lateral spread. They don't even actually know if the machine they encrypted was worth getting paid for. But they can do a lot of these with very low risk, because in 30 minutes, if they're not found, your stuff is gone. And that's it. And so they're very targeted, low sophistication, very low risk tolerance, do not really even attempt to laterally spread. In 30 minutes, you have to be very lucky to have gotten out of any modern, relatively reasonably well-secured system in there. Then come the mid and more sophisticated level attackers, things that use, for example, anything from LockBit onwards, like an MGM attack or a Caesar attack. Now, these do have considerable periods of time in which attackers are inside your system. So these are typically gangs, multiple people, each with their own specialty. And we are talking a lot of different specializations in here. If I look at for example, at the MGM attack, the initial entry point was via social engineering and LinkedIn. And they walked into one machine of someone that was not particularly important, whose 2FA they could reset by calling IT with enough information from LinkedIn. They started moving laterally first, and then realized that the authentication system had accounts that were trusted inside the Azure, which allowed them to hop from their initial entry point into Azure. Once they dropped into MGM's Azure footprint, they moved laterally till they discovered that there was one other authentication point that was trusted that allowed them to come back on premises, except a different location on premise. This time they ended up in the VMware infrastructure of MGM. And this infrastructure, interestingly, managed their registration, their desks, their casinos, basically the daily operating business of MGM. And that is when things really went down. They got locked up. Now, this kind of an attack takes some time to do. And if you look at the sophistication of their persistence mechanism, they had literally created their own identity provider and created their own accounts within their identity provider. So you did not even, if you looked at your normal authentication, Active Directory, LDAP, you're not even going to see their users. So even after you've cleaned them out, they'll come right back. So this is exactly what Allan was saying. There's hundreds of thousands of dollars to millions of dollars in incident response bills that will come after this, as you have to go scrub your entire infrastructure. Well, the good thing about it is now you've got a nice, relatively clean, secure infrastructure till the next guy comes along. But you've improved your security posture, but this is not a lesson you want to learn. Or at least this is not a lesson you want to be taught by a malware operator. This is a lesson you want to learn from someone else's fault, not yours.
Right. Allan, can you weigh in on this as well?
You know, I think there's a combination of things. There's absolutely super sophisticated actors, and then there's the morons, right? And there's a lot of morons out there. The problem is we've given the morons really good tools to work with. Mimikatz is easy to use, but it's very effective and hard to detect. You can run it in memory.
That is correct.
Cobalt Strike is complex, but there's a lot of great scripts for how to use it, and there are cracked versions everywhere. Adfind to pull your Active Directory and get a list of usernames and passwords. Like, all of the tools are readily available, and then on top of that, you have on underground forums like Ramp, like XSS, all of these forums have these how-to manuals that have been written up. And the other thing that's unfortunate is, because they're so motivated to make money, even the idiots, when they get a ransom payment, they invest that ransom payment in making better tools. So we've seen this. There's one threat actor we've tracked in particular. So a lot of new ransomware actors, rather than joining up with a ransomware service, will use stolen code. There's Babook code, there's leaked Conti code, leaked LockBit code, leaked Chaos code. There are a number of different ransomware code bases out there that if you decide you want to start your own ransomware tomorrow, you can just get one of those, buy initial access off a forum or whatever, and then go deploy the ransomware. And it's going to fail a lot of the time because you don't know what you're doing. But all it needs to do is succeed that one time, you get a small ransom payment, 50,000, 100,000. And again, we've seen this with the threat actors, where literally what they'll do is they'll start with the Babook ransomware code because it's easy to use, it's readily available. They will get their first ransom payment. They will hire a developer because there are lots of developers now that have experience building better ransomware, and they'll use part of that ransom payment to say, hey, I need to make my ransomware better, and I need my tooling to be better when I get in there. And they'll use that money. The developer will help them make better, more effective ransomware. Then they'll hit a few more victims, get more money, and again reinvest part of that into making even better tools and better ransomware. And so what we'll see is, first time that we see this new ransomware, it shares 98% code base with Babook. By the time they've been operating for 6 months, it's only 30% shared code base with Babook because they've updated so much to it. And if they're managed to go for a full year, there's almost nothing because they've completely rewritten the code. So there are a lot of newbies, but we're helping to make them better by paying ransoms. And I'm not saying that we should ban ransom payments. I know that's a big discussion in a lot of governments right now. I mean, part of me, yes, let's ban ransom payments, but I know there are serious unintended consequences when you do that. Well, the analogy that we always have is there was a huge increase in kidnappings in the 70s and 80s in Italy, and so in 1991, Italy banned ransom payments to kidnappers. They not only banned ransom payments, but if you reported a kidnapping, they would freeze all your assets to make sure that you couldn't actually make a ransom payment. And what happened for the 2 years after that is the number of kidnappings went up, because the criminals knew that if you had a loved one and you sent them a finger, and you sent their family one of their fingers, you were going to find a way to get them that money, and then they could double extort you, because they would not only get the ransom payment, but then because you did something illegal, they could get you a second time with the ransom payment. Now, eventually it worked and it went down, but there was a lot of pain in those first couple of years. And I don't know if we're willing to go through that, but something needs to be done because our money is making these ransomware actors better. Sorry to be so gruesome.
No, it does, it does put a point on it for sure. This has been, I would like to just kind of wrap up, like bring this back to, you've covered so much about, the different types of ransomware, all the different ways they operate, the different motivations, things like that. And, I think the headline to this story is like, they're going to get in, right? So, companies are doing a great job of implementing super solid and sophisticated perimeter security solutions, or they're working towards that anyway, and things are going to get in. And so with everything you've described, I'd love to just have some final comments on how understanding all of these differences that you've covered can help an organization be ready. Like understanding the differences can help be ready for when the attack does happen than if they're not as familiar with the different types.
Absolutely. So you should always have some form of data resilience strategy. If your data gets ransomed, you should be able to find it, be able to detect it as early as possible, even if it is slow rate encryption that is going on, of expecting to catch up and encrypt everything over time. Even in those conditions, you should have a resilience strategy that catches it early and is able to get your data back. That's part one. Part two of the exercise is looking and monitoring your security infrastructure on a near continual basis, because you will typically see indicators. Think of it like little lights that are shining up and they're creating patterns. And this is effectively your CM. These are all the signals coming in from network monitoring systems, perimeter systems, firewall rule exceptions that logged in, that got logged because somebody came in. In that vast morass of data is actually the signals of that attack. Learning to recognize that That is a good security team's job. Unfortunately, that's what makes it hard. You need tools, and those signals are constantly changing. And this is where defense has become one of these arms races, where it's a continual improvement on both sides of the table. As defenses get stronger, security guys, the malware actors get more sophisticated as well. It's an arms race that is going on. It's an arms race that you have to stay on top of, because failure to do so, you only have to be wrong once for them to get in, at which point you're going to have a very bad few months.
Or in some case, years. I mean, we saw that with like the ransomware attack in Baltimore, where it took them 2 years to fully recover. We've you and I, Shreve, we've been doing this for a really long time, and for a really long time, the sort of the cliche has been defense in depth, but it really is. I mean, that's what we've talked about today, right? And despite the fact that we've been talking about it for 20 some years, people still don't do that very well. But thinking about everything that we talked about today, how do you detect that initial access? Well, you have to have better phishing controls, right? And ideally, your phishing control isn't somebody notices the phishing email, it's you've stopped it before it gets to that person. So much of security today relies on somebody's spidey sense going off, and that's just not a sustainable model. I mean, It's great. I love it when somebody in accounting says, hey, I got this looks weird. Thank you. I appreciate you reporting that. That's awesome. It sucks that we let it get to you in the first place. But then, even things before then. So if you look at the scattered spider attack on MGM and Caesars, they registered a bunch of MGM and Caesars themed domain names to use as part of their attack. So are you doing domain monitoring as sort of a canary in the coal mine? Hey, somebody's trying to come after us. Let's check these things. So even before the attack started, you could have had warnings that something was coming your way. But how do you stop that phishing attack? Are you doing a good job of patching your perimeter? Citrix Bleed in all the news right now, but it is a patchable vulnerability. The patch is out there. Are you patching everything that is, at least everything that's internet exposed, and certainly things that are being used, and are you prioritizing your patching correctly? And then once they get in the network, you talked a lot about scripts, right? A lot of PowerShell. Are you logging PowerShell? So many organizations that I went into after an attack, I'm like, where are your PowerShell logs? Oh, we didn't do that because it was too expensive to feed it in Splunk. And I totally get it, man. Splunk gets really expensive when you're sending everything into it, but you have to prioritize the things that are going to help you detect the bad guys, and not being able to look through PowerShell scripts is going to hinder your investigation. I do think that one of the challenges that we have broadly in the security community is we as security vendors often make things worse. And I know it's a terrible thing to say on a security vendor webinar, but we sometimes introduce more complexity than necessary. Famously, and I know you and I have talked about this in the past, the Target breach, and it's actually 10 years old this month, so congratulations to it. Was caught by FireEye, but nobody at Target's Security Operations Center was looking at the FireEye console, because FireEye at the time didn't integrate with whatever SIEM they were using. And so if you're not looking, you shouldn't be hit because you didn't happen to look at the right console on the right day when the threat actor decided to come after you. So that centralization of your security tools, that interoperability of your security tools is very important. And if you have a vendor that's like, no, we won't integrate with that, fire them and find one that will. You could, because you have to be able to centralize everybody. And like your SOC, training your SOC and training the people in your SOC, especially this time of year when everybody wants to be home and on vacation, and instead they're going to be stuck on Christmas Eve, working the overnight shift. make sure you're getting them donuts or something and letting them know how much you love them for trying to keep the network safe. Because there's going to be fewer of them than usual, and the bad guys know this, so the attacks are going to ramp up. So it's not like a Christmas vacation for them. It's all of these things that we have to do, and unfortunately we have to do them all at the same time. We don't have the luxury of saying, I'm going to do this month. You talked about identity and access management, right? You can't say, well, I'm going to focus on phishing this month and then next month do identity and access management. It's got to be all of them at the same time. The last time you and I had lunch, I talked about the analogy I like to use because I love 70s Kung Fu movies. There's always that one scene where Bruce Lee has got to take on 7 guys at the same time. And if you're in a SOC, that's basically what you are right now, is you are Bruce Lee being hit by 7 people at the same time. And you can't just say, I'm going to ignore this one, because that's the guy that's going to hit you over the head with the wrench. So you need to basically be like that and be able to swivel in how you're defending against these different types of attacks.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you for that. We are, unfortunately, for this webinar just about at time, because I want to make sure we have some time for Q&A from everybody. But this has been absolutely fascinating. I hope we'll be able to do a follow-up. Thank you both for joining. And so now we will move on to the Q&A part of the presentation. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for watching this great webinar. Hi, Srinidhi. Thank you so much for staying on to answer Q&A from the audience. Really nice to have you here. We have a few questions, and I'm just going to go through them if that's okay. Okay, great. So here's the first one. Some municipal organizations, including school districts, have cyber insurance that could be a reason for ransomware targeting them, counting on the cyber insurance covering the ransom. Do you have a perspective on that? If that's contributing to like increases in attacks?
That's kind of a circular argument, I would say, over there. If you get attacked, you get cyber insurance, and then if you have cyber insurance, you become a target of attack. So it's like no escape, right? Yes and no. In some cases, attackers do know that there is cyber insurance, particularly if it is a large firm. But if they know it's a large firm they're attacking, the attack is typically quite sophisticated, number one. And number two, independent of whether they had cyber insurance or not, they know there is valuable goods on there, either in data exfiltration or in ransoming the data. So in both of those cases, I do believe it really doesn't play that big of a role other than sort of soften the blow for the one getting attacked.
Totally makes sense. Here's another one. Will be an interesting answer. What would you recommend to prevent or at least slow down the lateral spread from something like a social engineered entry point?
Oh, that's a good one. Usually hard, but the basics of it are as follows. I mean, the entry vector can be anywhere. And these days, everything from unpatched applications to somebody clicking the wrong thing, to a disgruntled employee actually providing credentials to be able to get in. It doesn't really matter. The entry vector is quite large. So then the question is, how do you prevent it from spreading across the infrastructure and making the problem a lot worse than it began? And the answer to that is to scan regularly and scan often. Don't assume that if you scan once every couple of days, life is good. Particularly if you're going up, since ransomware operators end up going after backups, every time data goes into any form of stable storage that you consider to be immutable, whether it's an air-gap backup, whether it is even your regular backup, you should be scanning it before it gets in there.
Gotcha. So it sounds like you can't really blink these days, or you're at risk. Just a couple more I think that we have time for. One, someone is asking specifically if you've seen ransomware targeted specifically at Macs.
So ransomware on Macs actually have a long history. They've been around since 2014, right from when ransomware became popular even on PC platforms. They were just a lot rarer. But these days, Macs are indeed targeted, not as much still, anywhere close to be honest, compared to Windows systems. but it is getting prominent enough that major ransomware as a service operators, for example, LockBit, actually support the Mac as a platform. So you can go to these guys, pay them your cut, 20% cut of the proceeds, and you can actually get access to a complete ransomware engine that is multi-platform. It also does Linux.
Oh, wow. Nothing is safe, I think, is the predominant theme.
That is true.
And then we just have one more that we have time for today. Everybody on the webinar, if you have questions that we didn't have time to answer or anything like that, I'm going to be sending out an email to all of you with a link to the recording, and you can, my email address will be in there. Please feel free to send them on to me, and you know, I'll make sure that we can get you what you're looking for. But just to wrap up, oh, this is interesting. Somebody wants to know how you would avoid wasting time on false positives when there's so many different ways in for ransomware, and that could equal just tons and tons of alerts.
That is actually true, right? I mean, that is the curse of the security landscape, that we all have things that we see that we believe we should alert on. And there are absolutely certain conditions under which that alert is probably the most important thing you should be looking at. But most of the time it becomes lost inside the entire sort of haystack of false positives sitting in there. So one of the things, honestly, is you should push your security vendors into making sure the false positive rates are really small, to be honest. Yes, some of these alerts should be indicators to CM to be able to correlate with other equivalent alerts also of sufficiently low category coming from other systems. The main alerts are the ones that should be coming out, the ones that should be in either bold orange or bold red going in there, indicating, okay, you're very close to being attacked. And yes, you have been attacked, and there is guaranteed proof of that. But below these two thresholds, there is quite a few alerts that are out there that end up getting thrown on the CM. And if a particular alert is misbehaving, in the sense it's coming up too many times, the most common thing people end up doing is suppressing the alert. And if you suppress the alert, then actually when it's doing something useful, it's not doing anything.
Right.
So the net of it really is that security vendors do have to sort of bucketize their alerts. And a certain set of alerts should only be really machine read and machine responded to in some sense, where it's correlating across similar alerts from other systems. When that does not happen, it simply makes the life of SOC teams hard.
Excellent. Thank you for that. So we are just about at time. So as I said, I encourage everybody, please, to reach out to me. I'll share my email address in an email, and we'll pass on anything else. But other than that, Srinidhi, thank you so much. And thanks to Allan as well for a great webinar. Thanks for your answers to these questions, and we will look forward to the next one. All right. Thanks,
Thank you,
everybody.
guys.
Bye-bye.